bread was still in the oven. This is the thing I keep coming back to, the detail that refuses to let go of me, the one image that concentrates everything I want to say about what happened on the morning of the 24th of August in the year 79 of the Common Era. The bread was still in the oven when the archaeologists excavating the bakery of Modestus in the Pompeian neighbourhood of Region 6 uncovered the oven. They found inside it 81 loaves of carbonized bread, perfectly preserved in their charred form, still in the rounded shape the baker had given them when he placed them to bake that morning. The bread had been put in to bake. The mountain had not given the baker time to take it out. The bread is in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples now. It looks, under the glass of its display case, exactly like what it is. Bread that someone made and never ate. Bread that has been waiting, in its carbonized patience, for 2,000 years. It has the round scored top that Roman bakers stamped on their loaves to make them easy to divide into portions. It has the imprint of the pan in which it was baked. It is, in every physical respect, a loaf of bread, except that it is made of carbon, not of wheat, and it is 2 millennia old, and the person who made it died on the same morning they put it in to bake. I have been thinking about that baker for a long time. We do not know his name with certainty. The bakery belonged to a man identified in the painted electoral notices on the walls outside as Modestus, and some scholars believe Modestus was the baker himself. Others think he was a property owner who rented the space to someone else. We do not know exactly what time the baker put the bread in the oven that morning, or whether he was watching it when the mountain began, or whether he had time to know what was happening before it happened to him. We know only what his hands made, preserved by the same catastrophe that killed the hands that made it. This is the gift and the grief of Pompeii in one object, the most ordinary thing in the world, preserved by the most extraordinary event in the history of the city, telling us more about a single morning than the grandest official inscription could tell about a century. This is the peculiar gift that Pompeii has given to history, the gift of the ordinary, preserved by the extraordinary. The catastrophe that destroyed the city was so sudden and so complete that it froze a single day, a single morning, in a kind of involuntary, perfect detail that no other archaeological site in the world can match. We have cities that are older than Pompeii, and cities that were larger, and cities that were more politically significant. But we have no other city that gives us, with this specificity and this completeness, the texture of daily life as it was actually lived by ordinary people, going about their ordinary business on an ordinary morning 2,000 years ago. I want to take you there, not to the eruption, though we will get to it, because it is impossible not to, but to the morning before, to the city as it was when the people who lived in it woke up and began their day and had no reason to think it would be any different from any other August day in the prosperous, busy, contentious, very Roman city of Pompeii. The city woke early. This was true of every ancient city, because the logic of life before artificial lighting was to use the hours of natural light as fully as possible, and that meant being up before or at sunrise. The streets of Pompeii, those stepping stone-equipped lanes that were designed to allow pedestrians to cross without getting their feet wet when the streets were washed clean by rain or by the water released from the fountains that overflowed into the street drains, were already busy when the sky was still pale. The delivery carts that were prohibited from the city centre during the day had been making their final deliveries of the morning, and the sound of their iron-rimmed wheels on the stone-paved streets had faded as the traffic rules took effect at sunrise. The bread in Modestus's oven had been started before dawn, as it was every morning, because the first customers for fresh bread came early. The city had a population of perhaps 11,000 people at this point, living in a walled area of about 66 hectares. It was not a large city by Roman standards. Rome itself, with its 1 million inhabitants, made Pompeii look like a village, but it was prosperous, a commercial centre for the rich agricultural hinterland of the Campanian plain. A port city, connected by road to Naples and to the wider network of the Roman economy. The Via Appia ran near it. The Bay of Naples spread before it, one of the most beautiful stretches of water in the Mediterranean, visible from the upper floors of the city's grander houses and from the high ground of the amphitheatre district. And to the north, visible from almost anywhere in the city on a clear day, the mountain. The mountain had always been there. The Pompeians had lived in its shadow for centuries, and the mountain had never, not in any living memory, not in any historical memory, not in any account that had survived, done what it was about to do. The rich volcanic soil of its lower slopes was some of the most fertile land in the Mediterranean, and the vines that produced the wine for which the region was famous grew up those slopes in ordered rows. The mountain was, in the minds of the people who lived beneath it, a geographical feature of the landscape, not a threat. Some ancient writers, including the geographer Strabo, had noted the mountain's unusual appearance and speculated about a possible volcanic origin, but the last major eruption had occurred approximately 3,000 years before Pompeii's last day, and there was no cultural memory of it and no scientific understanding of what the mountain was. There had been signs in the years and months preceding. A major earthquake in 62 CE, 17 years before the eruption, had damaged many of the city's buildings significantly, and the evidence of that earthquake's effects and the subsequent repairs is visible throughout the archaeological site. Many buildings were still being repaired or rebuilt in 79. The process of reconstruction was the dominant feature of the city's built environment in those years, and the earthquake of 62 had not been the only tremor. There had been smaller earthquakes in the subsequent years, and in the weeks immediately before the eruption there had been significant seismic activity, along with disturbances to the water supply as the ground shifted. Some residents had left the city in the preceding days, concerned by the tremors. Most had stayed because earthquakes were a known feature of life in Campania, and because the city was in the middle of an economic and social season that made departure impractical or undesirable. The date of the eruption has itself been a subject of scholarly discussion. The traditional date, August 24th, comes from the letter written by Pliny the Younger to the historian Tacitus, in which he describes the eruption from his vantage point at Misenum, across the Bay of Naples, and the death of his uncle Pliny the Elder, who commanded the Roman fleet at Misenum and died in the eruption, attempting to rescue survivors by sea. But some scholars have argued, based on the archaeological evidence of autumn fruits found in the city and the clothing found on some of the victims, that the eruption may have occurred in October rather than August. The debate is not resolved. For the purposes of this particular morning, I will follow the traditional August date, while acknowledging that the specific calendar day may have been different. Let me walk you through the city, not through the grandest parts, not the forum with its temples and its public buildings, not the amphitheatre or the theatre, but through the ordinary districts, the streets where the 11,000 people of Pompeii woke up and began their day. The street called the Via dell'Abbondanza, the Street of Abundance, named by modern archaeologists for a relief of a goddess found near its eastern end, was the main commercial artery of the city, running east-west through the city's central section. It was lined with shops and workshops and bars on both sides. The shops had wide counterfronts that opened directly onto the street, with the familiar Roman system of terracotta dolia, large storage containers embedded in the countertops, holding the food and drink for sale. The bars of Pompeii, of which there were at least 150 scattered through the city, a remarkable number for a city of 11,000, approximately one bar for every 73 inhabitants, served wine diluted with water and hot food from the dolia, and were the social centres of working-class Pompeian life. They were also, judging by the graffiti that covers the walls of the bars and the surrounding streets, places of considerable social vitality. The walls record gambling debts, insults, declarations of affection, political endorsements, crude jokes, and the names of gladiators who were apparently as famous and as discussed in Pompeii as celebrities are anywhere. The graffiti. I need to spend time with the graffiti, because it is the most direct surviving voice of the Pompeians. Approximately 11,000 pieces of graffiti have been recorded at Pompeii, scratched or painted onto the walls of buildings and streets by the city's inhabitants. They are not dignified, they are not literary, they are exactly what you would expect from the writings of ordinary people who had access to blank walls and something they wanted to say. They are personal, petty, funny, obscene, affectionate, political, and completely human in a way that no official document or literary text can be. Some examples, taken from the actual graffiti recovered from the walls and rendered here in their sense rather than their exact words. Somebody has written that a certain Successus is in love with a girl named Iris who doesn't care about him. Someone else, perhaps Successus himself, has replied, defending his chances. Someone has recorded, with apparent satisfaction, that a man named Phileros is a liar, A student has written out a passage from Virgil on a wall near the basilica. Near a bakery, someone has written, "If anyone does not invite Nuxeria here, may he be blind." The electoral notices, the painted slogans endorsing candidates for the local offices of the city government that were applied to walls by professional sign painters, are everywhere, endorsing specific candidates for the positions of duovir and aedile, the magistrates who governed the city's day-to-day affairs. The elections for these positions had recently been held, and the winning candidates, whoever they were, would never have the chance to exercise the offices they had campaigned for. The electoral politics of Pompeii, reconstructed from these painted slogans, were lively and specific. Candidates were endorsed by named individuals and by named professional groups. The fruit sellers endorsed this candidate, the muleteers endorsed that one, the goldsmiths support this third one. The endorsements by specific professional guilds suggest an organised political life in which commercial communities acted collectively in civic matters, which is not surprising in a prosperous trading city. The campaigns were sufficiently competitive that opposing groups mounted counter-campaigns, and there are cases where a notice of endorsement from a disreputable source, the sign painters apparently had a sense of humour, was clearly intended to damage rather than help a candidate. The politics of Pompeii was not, of course, the grand politics of Rome. The city was a municipium, a self-governing town within the Roman framework, with its own local magistrates and its own local council, but its relationship to the wider empire was one of dependence on the imperial system that guaranteed security and trade. The local magistrates dealt with local matters, the repair of roads, the maintenance of public buildings, the adjudication of commercial disputes, the organisation of public games. The amphitheatre that dominated the eastern section of the city, one of the oldest stone amphitheatres in the Roman world, dating to about 70 BCE, was the site of the gladiatorial games that were one of the primary forms of civic entertainment and that were financed by the local elite as a form of public benefaction. The gladiators were local celebrities, as the graffiti makes clear, and the games were major social events that drew visitors from the surrounding region, the gladiators of Pompeii. They lived in a large training facility, the gladiatorial barracks, near the large theatre at the centre of the city, and the evidence of their lives there is extraordinary. The skeletons of 19 people were found in one of the rooms of the barracks, people who had taken shelter there when the eruption began and were killed by the pyroclastic material that eventually reached the building. Among them were several women and children who should not have been in a gladiatorial barracks by any of the social rules we know about, but who were there, suggesting that the building had become an informal refuge for whoever could reach it. There were also gladiatorial weapons and armour found in the barracks, and the specific equipment of different gladiatorial types, the murmillo, the thrax, the retarius, visible in the archaeological record. One of the rooms contained a woman's jewellery, fine gold objects that had no business being in a gladiatorial training facility, which has led some scholars to speculate that a wealthy woman had established a liaison with one of the gladiators, a scenario that the graffiti elsewhere in the city and the known patterns of gladiatorial celebrity make entirely plausible. Let me give you some specific people. The archaeology of Pompeii has given us a remarkable number of named individuals, through graffiti, through the painted electoral notices, through inscriptions on public buildings and private property markers, through the wax tablets that recorded commercial transactions and were preserved in carbonized form. None of these people are historically significant in any conventional sense. They are local figures, important only within the boundaries of the city and its commercial network, but they are real, and their reality is the reality I am most interested in. Gaius Julius Polybius is one of the more frequently mentioned names in the Pompeian political record. His name appears in multiple electoral endorsements, and he seems to have been a man of considerable local standing, possibly a freedman who had risen to prominence, given that his cognomen Polybius is a Greek name often associated with freed slaves in the Roman period. He owned or operated several properties in the city, including a large house near the Forum that has been excavated and that contained a significant number of amphorae and other commercial goods. Whatever his origins, by the time of the eruption he was a figure of local significance who had participated in the city's civic life and whose name was recognized on the streets. Julia Felix was the owner of a large property in the Via dell'Abbondanza that she rented out in sections, a suite of baths, a set of shop spaces, an upper-story apartment. the rental notice survives, painted on the outside wall of the property, advertising the available spaces and their amenities. Julia Felix was, by this notice, a businesswoman of the kind that the Roman world produced more frequently than is often recognized. A property owner managing a commercial enterprise in her own name, engaged in the urban rental market that was one of the primary forms of investment in Roman cities. Her property was large and well appointed, and the rental notice's specific mention of refined baths suggests a degree of commercial sophistication in how she marketed her amenities. The House of the Tragic Poet, named for a mosaic of a theatrical director found in one of its rooms, was a modest but well-decorated house near the Via dell'Abbondanza. Its owner is not known by name, but the house has given us one of the most famous objects from Pompeii, the floor mosaic at its entrance, showing a chained dog with the inscription Cave Canum, beware of the dog. The person who commissioned this mosaic had a sense of humour or a concern about visitors, or both. They also had good taste. The mosaics and paintings in the House of the Tragic Poet are of high quality relative to the house's modest size, suggesting an owner who invested in domestic decoration, even in a small space. The dog is still there in the mosaic, still chained, still warning, for all the good it did. There was a dog in the city when the eruption happened. Not the mosaic dog, but a real dog. Its skeleton was found in the house of Vesonius Primus, still wearing its bronze collar, with the inscription indicating it had been twice recovered after going missing. The dog's name, if it had one beyond the dog of Vesonius Primus, is not recorded. Its collar records that its owner had retrieved it twice when it went missing, which suggests an attachment either to the dog's monetary value as a guard animal, or to the animal itself, or both. The dog was still there when the eruption happened. Its skeleton was found in a contorted position, suggesting it had died trying to reach higher ground as the volcanic material rose around it. The social life of Pompeii was organised around the bar and the bath. The baths of Pompeii, the Stabian baths, the Forum baths, the central baths that were under construction when the city died, were not merely places to wash. They were the social centres where business was conducted, gossip was exchanged, political opinion was formed, and the body was treated to the sequence of hot, warm and cold immersions that the Roman bathing tradition had developed into a form of daily ritual. The baths charged a small entry fee and were open to men and women at different hours, with the more elaborate establishments providing not just the bathing pools, but attached facilities for exercise, food, and the various grooming services that the Roman world offered. Hair removal, massage, the application of oil, all of which were done by specialised attendants. The morning hour at the baths would have been busy with the people who had already completed their morning tasks and were taking the traditional Roman bath before the midday meal. The furnaces that heated the baths burned wood continuously, and the heating system, the hypocaust, the system of channels beneath the floor and in the walls that distributed the hot air, had been burning since before dawn. The bathers moved through the sequence of rooms, the frigidarium with its cold plunge, the tepidarium with its warm air, and the benches where the oil and strigil treatment was performed, the caldarium with its hot water pool, and the labrum of cold water for pouring over the head. The specific smell of a Roman bath was particular, and not entirely pleasant by modern standards. The mixture of wood smoke from the furnaces, the sweat and oil of the bathers, the damp stone of the pools, the chemical smell of the various substances used in grooming. But it was a smell that was entirely familiar to anyone who had grown up in a Roman city, as deeply associated with the daily rhythm of life as the smell of bread from the bakeries or the animal smell of the streets. The streets of Pompeii smelled of animal. This is something that tends to get lost in the modern contemplation of ancient Rome, because our imagination of the ancient city is formed by the visual evidence, the statues, the paintings, the mosaics, the architecture, which is almost entirely odourless. But the ancient city was intensely sensory, in ways that the modern city is not, and the dominant sense experience of a Roman street was probably olfactory rather than visual. Livestock were kept within the city. Fulleries, the establishments that cleaned and processed wool cloth using human urine as a bleaching agent, were distributed through the residential and commercial districts. The fish sauce factories, of which several have been identified in Pompeii, produced garum, the fermented fish paste that was the Romans' most important condiment by a process of prolonged fermentation that was not, by any contemporary account, pleasant to be near. The street drains carried wastewater and animal waste to the outlets in the city walls. The food stalls and the bars cooked and fermented and rotted in their natural course. The ancient city was alive in its smells in a way that the archaeological site, scrubbed clean by 2,000 years and stripped of its organic content, cannot convey. The morning of the 24th of August was, by all indications from the geological and atmospheric evidence, a late summer day. The Bay of Naples in August is typically hot and hazy, the sea a deep blue-green, the hills around the bay dried brown by the summer heat, the air still and thick in the valleys and moving in reliably in the afternoon sea breeze. The grain harvest had been completed weeks before. The grape harvest was approaching but had not yet begun. The autumn fruits that archaeologists have found at the site, including pomegranates and figs, suggest that the season was in the transition between summer's end and autumn's beginning, when the grapes on the slopes of the mountain were reaching their peak ripeness. The mountain would have looked, that morning, as it always looked. Large, familiar, slightly hazy in the August heat. There is no account from within the city of what the Pompeians observed in the hours before the eruption began. No written testimony from anyone who was inside the city and survived. The surviving accounts are all from people who were outside the city, at a distance. Pliny the Younger at Misenum, 18 miles away across the bay, his letters to Tacitus, written approximately 25 years after the event, are the most complete contemporary account of what the eruption looked like from the outside. He describes seeing a column of cloud rising from the mountain at approximately the 7th hour, early afternoon by the Roman reckoning, that he compared in shape to a pine tree, rising on a tall trunk and then spreading at the top into branches. This description of what we now call a Plinian eruption column, the characteristic mushroom cloud shape of a large explosive volcanic eruption, is so accurate and so vivid that volcanologists use the term Plinian eruption in his honor. But that was the afternoon. What was happening in the morning hours before the visible eruption began was a build-up of pressure within the mountain that left almost no surface evidence. The seismic activity that had disturbed the preceding days and weeks was part of this build-up, but by the morning of the eruption's day, the seismic activity may have temporarily subsided, or the Pompeians may simply have stopped paying close attention to tremors that had become, over the preceding years, a familiar irritation rather than an alarm. The water supply disturbances that preceded the eruption, the wells going dry, the springs changing flow, would have been noticed and talked about, but without any framework for understanding what they meant. The fountain at the Via dell'Abbondanza junction was running. This is something we can say with confidence from the hydraulic evidence. The city's water system, which was fed by an aqueduct bringing water from the springs of the Apennine Hills, was still operating on the day of the eruption. The public fountains were overflowing in the usual way, keeping the streets clean and the dogs and horses and the children who played in the streets supplied with water. The water pressure was normal. The mountain had not yet given any signal that was interpretable as catastrophic. Who was in the city that morning? This is a question that the archaeology can partially answer, but only partially. Pompeii's normal population of 11,000 had been affected in recent days by the seismic activity. Some people had left, and some visitors, who might otherwise have been in the city, had perhaps avoided coming. The city's population at the time of the eruption is generally estimated to be somewhat lower than its normal complement, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. What we can say is that the people who were in the city were distributed across the full social range of a Roman provincial city. Slaves, who made up a substantial portion of the population and who had no choice about whether to stay. Freedmen, former slaves who had achieved legal freedom but who remained tied to the city through their businesses and their social networks. Freeborn citizens of varying wealth, tradespeople, artisans, shopkeepers, the domestic staff of the great houses, the occasional traveller passing through, and the elite families who owned the city's largest houses, and who exercised the local political power that the electoral notices advertised. The elite families of Pompeii had names that we know: the Holconii, the Epidii, the Estacidii, the Lucretii Valentes, families who had funded public buildings and public games, and whose portraits decorated the walls of public spaces, and whose electoral endorsements carried weight in the political life of the city. They lived in houses of considerable size and elaboration, with their atria and their peristyle gardens and their painted walls and their mosaic floors, and the specific architectural program that displayed wealth in the ways that the Roman elite recognized as appropriate. Their households included dozens of slaves engaged in every aspect of domestic management: cooking, cleaning, attending the person of the family members, managing the accounts, teaching the children, running errands, and doing all the physical labor of an ancient household of any pretension. The slaves of Pompeii are present in the archaeological record in a way that is both abundant and frustratingly indirect. Their names appear in inscriptions and in commercial documents as they transact business on behalf of their owners. Their physical presence is recorded in the shapes of the spaces they occupied: the cramped sleeping quarters behind the kitchen, the small rooms adjacent to the service entrances of the great houses, the cells in the back sections of the large estates outside the city walls where agricultural slaves were housed. Some of them were skilled craftspeople whose work was essential to the city's commercial life. Some of them were educated individuals, tutors, secretaries, managers, who occupied positions of considerable responsibility within the household hierarchy, while remaining legally property. None of them had a choice about where they were on the morning of the 24th of August. The bar of Salvius, whose painted sign showed two men playing dice and a female bar worker carrying a jug, was probably open early that morning. The bars of Pompeii served a morning trade in bread and porridge and watered wine to the working-class population who did not have the kitchen facilities to cook at home. Most of the city's population lived in multi-story apartment buildings. The insula and the tenants of the upper floors had little or no cooking capacity, which meant that the bars and the thermopolia, the hot food establishments that sold prepared dishes from the terracotta dolia embedded in their counters, provided the primary catering for a substantial fraction of the city's population. We can tell something about what was on the menu from the analysis of the biological material recovered from the drains and the dolia and the floor deposits of the commercial food establishments. Fish sauce, obviously. Garum appears in everything. Grain in various preparations, legumes, olives, the specific regional products of the Campanian countryside, locally grown figs, the small sweet grapes of the volcanic soil, nuts, eggs, pork in its various preparations. The sea provided fish and shellfish that were brought fresh to the city's market from the boats that worked the bay. Wine from the local vineyards, diluted to varying degrees with water and sometimes flavoured with honey or spices, served at temperatures that the Roman tradition did not particularly distinguish from cold to hot in the way that modern habit does. The people eating at the bar of Salvius or at the thermopolium of Vetusius Placidus were not eating in silence. The bars were noisy, competitive places, and the graffiti on their walls records the arguments and the gambling and the romantic negotiations that were their standard social content. The dice games that the painting on Salvius's bar depicted were illegal in theory. Roman law prohibited dice gambling in public, except during the festival of Saturnalia in December, and were routinely conducted in bars across the empire in defiant disregard of the prohibition. The noise of dice on a wooden table, the argument about a contested throw, the discussion of the gladiatorial games, and the performances in the theatre, all of this was the ambient sound of the bar in the morning hours of a late summer day. The theatre of Pompeii was in the central section of the city, near the gladiatorial barracks and the large triangular forum that served as the precinct for its associated temples. There were two theatres, the large open-air theatre that seated approximately 5,000 people, and the smaller roofed Odeon that was used for musical performances and smaller theatrical events. The theatrical season in Pompeii, as in other Roman cities, was associated with festivals and religious occasions, and the calendar of performances was not a daily one. The theatre was not like a bar, something available every morning, but the theatres were active civic spaces even when not in use for performance, and the area around them was part of the city's public life. The temples of Pompeii. The city had several significant religious establishments: the Temple of Jupiter at the north end of the Forum, the Temple of Apollo adjacent to it, the Temple of Isis near the theatres, the Temple of Venus near the Marine Gate, and various smaller shrines scattered through the residential neighbourhoods. The religious life of the city was not organised around a single faith or a single institution. It was the characteristic polytheism of the Roman world, in which multiple cults operated simultaneously, and the same person might participate in several of them at different times for different purposes. The worship of Venus, patroness of the city, present everywhere in its decoration and its public art, was particularly prominent in Pompeii, which may have been one reason the city had maintained a special devotion to the goddess of love and beauty, even in the increasingly imperial religious environment of the late 1st century. The Temple of Isis had been rebuilt after the earthquake of 62 at the expense of a 6-year-old boy. More precisely, at the expense of his father, who used the rebuilding of the temple as a vehicle for advancing the boy's social career in the way that public benefaction functioned in Roman civic life. An inscription records this donation with the names of the father and the child. The child's name was Numerius Papidius Celsinus, and the rebuilding of the temple earned him admission to the local senate, the Decurions, at an age when no Roman male would normally have been eligible for such a position, as a reward to the family for their civic generosity. Numerius Papidius Celsinus was presumably still alive on the morning of the eruption, 6 years older than he had been when the temple was rebuilt in his name, perhaps 12 years old now, perhaps somewhere in the city, perhaps at the Temple of Isis that his family had rebuilt. I keep looking for the specific people in this city, not the monuments, not the archaeological classifications, not the stratigraphic layers, the people. And the city gives them to us, in fragments, in the walls and the documents and the bones and the artifacts. The baker of Modestus, still at his oven. The dog of Versonius Primus, still in his collar. Numerius Papidius Celsinus, 6 years old when he became a benefactor of Isis, 12 now, somewhere in the city. Julia Felix, businesswoman, with her baths and her rental signs. The anonymous lover of Iris, who wrote his feelings on a wall, in the knowledge or hope that she might walk past and read them. Pliny the Elder, across the bay, who would sail toward the mountain and die in an attempt to help people who needed help. The eruption began, in geological terms, some hours before Pliny saw his pine tree cloud over the mountain. The seismic activity in the days preceding had been increasing, and in the hours before noon on the day of the eruption, the activity intensified dramatically. The water in the pipes and the wells would have been more visibly disturbed. The ground movement would have been felt, and then, at some point in the early afternoon, the 7th hour of the Roman day, approximately 1 in the afternoon by our reckoning, the eruption column burst through the summit of the mountain. The first phase of the eruption was not the end. It was the beginning of a process that would take approximately 19 hours to complete. The initial eruption sent a column of volcanic material, ash, pumice, gas, rising to approximately 32 kilometers altitude, where it spread laterally in the characteristic pine tree shape that Pliny described. The pumice that fell from this column began raining down on the city at a rate that accumulated rapidly, 3 to 4 millimeters of accumulation per hour in the early stages. Increasing as the eruption intensified, the pumice was light enough that it did not immediately crush the buildings. It took many hours before the accumulated weight caused roofs to fail, but it was heavy enough and plentiful enough to make the streets increasingly impassable. The people of Pompeii had time, not much time, and not the time to understand what was happening or what it would mean, but time enough to make decisions. Some of them fled immediately at the first indication that the mountain was doing something unprecedented. Some of them sheltered in place, waiting for the pumice fall to end. Some of them tried to escape through the gates, only to find the streets outside the city walls already knee-deep in pumice. The evidence of the human response to the disaster is visible in the archaeology of the escape attempts and the sheltering positions, in the bodies found at the city gates, crushed by pumice or struck by the larger fragments that the eruption occasionally threw out, in the bodies found in cellars and inner rooms where people had taken shelter in the heaviest walled spaces they could find, waiting, in the bodies found in the streets, caught in the open. The end, when it came not from the pumice fall but from what followed it. In the early hours of the morning following the eruption's beginning, somewhere between 1 and 7 in the morning of the 25th of August, the eruption column collapsed. The enormous mass of volcanic material that had been held aloft by the eruption's force came down in a series of pyroclastic density currents, the flows of superheated gas and volcanic material that travel at speeds of hundreds of kilometers per hour and at temperatures of several hundred degrees. These flows reached Pompeii. When they did, the city was already buried under meters of pumice. The roofs of many buildings had collapsed under the accumulated weight, and the people who had survived the previous hours were in whatever shelter they had found. The pyroclastic flows killed instantly, by the combination of superheating and toxic gases. The bodies of the victims, buried in the volcanic material that later hardened into a kind of cast, were preserved in their final positions, not as bodies, but as voids in the hardened ash, voids that the excavators of the 19th century discovered could be filled with plaster to reveal the exact form of the person who had died there. The casts. They are the most haunting objects in the entire archaeological record of Pompeii. A man lying on his back, with his arm across his face, as if shielding his eyes from something. A woman pulling her garment over her face. Two people embracing, or one holding the other. A family group, huddled together in a corner. A child, curled. The casts are not skeletons. They are the shapes of bodies, the exact contours of specific people at the specific moment of their death, preserved by the volcanic material that surrounded them and hardened before the organic matter decomposed. They have fingernails. They have the specific expression of their last moment, mouths open, faces twisted. I find the casts almost impossible to contemplate directly. There is something about them that feels more intrusive than any other form of archaeological evidence, more personal, more specific in their violation of the privacy of a moment that no one was intended to witness. The person who died in the House of the Mysteries, reaching toward the door. The body found at the Marine Gate, almost certainly a man who had been fleeing the city when the pyroclastic flow overtook him. These were specific individuals, specific in the curve of their spine and the position of their hands and the size of their feet. And they are there to be looked at, and I am not sure that we have earned the right to look, but they are also the clearest possible testimony to what the city was. A place where specific people lived and worked and loved and argued and ate bread and kept dogs and built temples and wrote on walls and made wine from grapes that grew on the slopes of the mountain that killed them. The casts are the city's last and most intimate statement about itself. We were here. We were this specific. We mattered in the way that all specific, ordinary lives matter. Not because of their historical significance, not because they will be remembered, but because they were real. The bread in the oven of Modestus. The 81 loaves, carbonized, still in the shape the baker gave them. Scored on top, as Roman bread was scored, round, as Roman bread was round. Made from the wheat of the Campanian plain, milled in one of the city's mills, proved through the night, shaped in the morning, placed in the oven to bake before the sun was fully up, and still in the oven when the mountain changed everything. The baker never took the bread out, but someone found it. Someone found it 2,000 years later, and recognized it as what it was, and put it in a case where it could be seen. And the bread is still there, carbonized and round and scored, still in the shape of what it was always intended to be. I think that matters. I think it matters that the baker made the bread, even though neither he nor we could have known this at the time, the bread would never be eaten, and would instead wait 2,000 years and tell us something we could not have learnt any other way about what a morning in Pompeii was like. The bread is a message from a person who did not intend to send a message. The bread says, I was here, I was doing this, I was making food for other people to eat. The bread says, this was my morning, and it was like other mornings, and it would have continued into afternoon and evening if it had been permitted to. The mountain was not interested in any of this. Mountains are not interested in anything. The mountain did what mountains of that specific geological character eventually do. And it did it on a specific morning, in a specific month, of a specific year, without any intention or meaning. The morning was ordinary, the mountain was not, and the gap between those two things, between the ordinary morning and the extraordinary end, is where the city of Pompeii has lived, in the minds and imaginations of the people who study it and think about it, for the nearly 2,000 years since it happened. The bread in the oven, the dog in his collar, the lover who wrote Iris's name on a wall, the 12-year-old patron of the goddess Isis, the gladiator whose wealthy admirer left her jewellery in his room, the unknown baker whose hands made 81 loaves one last morning, and whose name I do not know, and whose face I cannot see, but whose work I can look at in a glass case in Naples and understand, with a certainty that no historical account can quite provide, was real. They were real. The morning was real. The bread was real. And the mountain, which was not interested in any of them, made them permanent in the only way that mountains can, by ending everything so suddenly and so completely that nothing had time to change before the stillness came. I wish you a calm and peaceful night, but I have moved through the morning too quickly. Let me go back. Let me give the morning the time it deserves. Slow time, the time it took to actually live through, the time that the people of Pompeii experienced as ordinary time before the afternoon took it from them. The Forum of Pompeii was the political, religious and commercial heart of the city. It sat at the western end of the Via dell'Abbondanza, a large rectangular paved space surrounded on three sides by colonnaded buildings and on the north by the Temple of Jupiter. The Forum was not a park or an empty civic gesture. It was a working space, the busiest and most frequented public area in the city, the place where legal business was transacted in the basilica, where agricultural produce was sold in the market buildings, where official announcements were posted and public meetings were held. The Forum was also the place where the city's most ambitious architectural program was concentrated. The Temple of Jupiter was an imposing structure at the head of the space. The triumphal arch near it carried honorific inscriptions. The Macellum, the food market, was a well-appointed building with its own internal court. The earthquake of '62 had damaged the Forum's buildings severely, and in '79 the repair and rebuilding work was still ongoing in places. The morning visitors to the Forum would have included the legal practitioners conducting business in the basilica, advocates and their clients, witnesses and parties to contracts, the officials who administered the city's formal legal processes. They would have included the merchants who had set up in the Macellum and the other market spaces, selling fresh produce from the surrounding countryside and preserved foods from the city's commercial hinterland. They would have included the politicians and the socially ambitious, the men who needed to be seen in the Forum as part of their participation in the civic life that the Forum represented. And they would have included ordinary people passing through on their way somewhere else, stopping to read an announcement or exchange a word with an acquaintance. The Macellum of Pompeii, the large market building on the northeast side of the Forum, was one of the most significant commercial spaces in the city. It was organised around an internal courtyard with a central structure, probably the tholos, a columned round building that housed the fish market, and the surrounding walls contained individual shops and stalls. The evidence from the biological material in the drains of the Macellum tells us something about what was for sale there: fish and shellfish, as expected given the tholos's likely function. Grain and legumes, fruits, the specific seasonal produce of the late summer Campanian countryside, figs and pomegranates, the same autumn fruits that tell us it was the season of transition from summer to autumn. The Macellum would have been at its busiest in the morning hours, when the freshest produce was available, and the householders and their servants came to buy for the day's meals. The merchants who supplied the Macellum came from the surrounding countryside by road and from the sea by boat. The Via della Marina connected the Forum to the harbour on the south side of the city, and the goods that arrived by ship were carried through this gate and up this road into the commercial heart of the city. The amphora carriers, the men who transported the heavy ceramic containers of wine and olive oil and fish sauce that were the primary commodity of long-distance Roman trade, would have been a familiar sight in the streets near the harbour. The amphorae that have been found in Pompeii's shops and warehouses came from Spain, from North Africa, from Gaul, from various parts of Italy. A material record of the city's connection to the wider Roman trading network that extended from the Rhine to the Euphrates. The harbour itself, which sat below the city at the foot of the sea walls, was small compared to the great ports of the Roman world, but adequate for the trade that served Pompeii's regional market. Ships coming from Naples and Puteoli, the major port of the Bay of Naples, a city of considerable commercial and military significance, would have put in at Pompeii to deliver or collect cargo. The specific goods that Pompeii exported were primarily agricultural: the wine of the Campanian hinterland, the olive oil from the groves on the slopes below the mountain, the fish sauce produced in the city's factories, the fine Campanian pottery that was produced in the region and that has been found at sites across the Roman world. In exchange, Pompeii received the manufactured goods and exotic products that a prosperous regional centre required: the wine. The wine of Pompeii and the surrounding region was famous in the ancient world, and the evidence of the wine trade is everywhere in the archaeology of the city. The large wine jars stacked in the storerooms of the commercial properties, the painted signs advertising specific wines for sale in the bars, the agricultural equipment for viticulture found in the Villa Rustica estates outside the city walls. The grapevines on the slopes of the mountain were approaching their autumn harvest in August of '79. The grapes were heavy on the vines, and the vintners were preparing for the work of harvest that would come in September. Some of them were working on the mountain slopes on the morning of the eruption. They would have been among the first to see what was happening. There is a quality of grief specific to the contemplation of what was about to ripen and never did. The grapes on the mountain slopes, the bread in Modestus's oven, the electoral campaign whose winners would never take office, the rebuilding program that would never be finished. The house of the Vetti brothers, wealthy freedmen who had invested heavily in the decoration of their property with elaborate mythological paintings, was in the middle of having its garden replanted with formal beds and marble statuary. The garden was not yet finished. The workmen had left their tools. The tools were still there. The Vetti brothers, Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva, their names preserved in the signet rings found in the house, were freedmen who had made enough money through commerce to acquire one of the more elaborately decorated houses in the city. The decoration of the house of the Vetti is some of the most complete and the most vivid that survives at Pompeii. The walls of the triclinium, the dining room where the family and their guests ate, covered in panels showing mythological scenes, the Olympian gods in their full narrative detail, all in the rich reds and blacks and yellows of the Pompeian fourth style. The brothers had clearly invested heavily in the visual statement of their prosperity and their cultural ambitions in the way that the successful freedman class of the Roman world often did. The painting that declared you knew your mythology and could afford to have it displayed in your dining room was a form of social signalling that the Roman world understood clearly. The lararium in the entrance hall of a Pompeian house was the household shrine to the lares, the protective spirits of the household, the ancestors whose benevolent presence was understood to inhabit the domestic space. Every Pompeian house had one, from the grandest mansion to the most modest artisan's dwelling, and the lararia were decorated with paintings showing the specific iconography of the household cult. The lares themselves, usually shown as dancing young men, flanking a central figure of the genius, the generative spirit of the paterfamilias, and attended below by a serpent, the symbol of the earth and the productive power of the household. The morning ritual of the household included an offering to the lares, a small amount of food, a pinch of incense, a word of prayer. The household was in right relationship with its protective spirits. The spirits were honoured. The morning was beginning in its proper form. This is the thing I want you to feel, if you can feel it, the ordinariness. The prayers to the lares were as routine as putting the bread in the oven or opening the shutters on the bar. The people of Pompeii were not living in a heightened, dramatic, cinematically intense way. They were living in the specific, concrete, slightly boring way that daily life is actually lived, occupied with the immediate concerns of that morning, that meal, that transaction, that conversation. The apprentice in the workshop wondering if the master was going to be in a bad mood today. The woman in the upper story apartment calculating whether she had enough money to buy oil for the lamp. The slave in the kitchen of the large house thinking about the next task and the task after that. These were not people on the edge of history, they were people on the edge of lunch. The city was also living in its recent political past. The year 79 CE was the first year of the reign of Titus, who had become emperor on the death of his father Vespasian in June. Titus was not an unknown figure to the Pompeians. He had commanded the Roman forces that besieged and destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, and the memory of that campaign was still fresh in the Roman world. The political transition from Vespasian to Titus had been smooth, unusually so for the Roman Empire, and the Pompeians who paid attention to imperial politics, which was not necessarily everyone, but was certainly the political class, would have been adjusting to the new reign in the ways that a provincial city adjusts when it is distant from the centre of power, noting the change of the reigning name on official documents, updating the public monuments with the new emperor's titulature, thinking about what the new reign might mean for the tax situation, or the grain supply, or the commercial regulations. Titus would be devastated by what happened at Pompeii. He came to Campania twice in the immediate aftermath to survey the damage and organise relief, and the ancient sources describe him weeping at what he saw. He organised assistance for the survivors. There were survivors, people who had fled before the worst and who arrived in the surrounding towns and cities as refugees. And he appointed the commission of senior senators that was tasked with managing the relief and the property claims that the disaster generated. The disaster that would come to be called the eruption of Vesuvius happened in the first year of Titus's reign, and would have coloured how both contemporaries and subsequent generations perceived his time as emperor. His reign lasted only 2 years. He died of fever in 81 CE, and the historical tradition that formed around him treated him as an emperor who was tested by disasters and met them with appropriate generosity and effectiveness. The house of Marcus Lucretius Fronto was near the Via dell'Abbondanza, a medium-sized house whose walls were painted in the elaborate style that the city's prosperous middle class favoured. Fronto was a political figure of local significance, involved in the city's magistracies, his name appearing in the electoral notices. His house's paintings included portraits of the family members, not identified by inscription, but assumed to be the family, and mythological scenes appropriate to a household of cultural pretension. What Fronto was doing on the morning of the eruption, where he was in the city, whether he escaped or not, none of this is recorded. He was there, in the city, in the network of relationships and obligations that his political and commercial life had built. The amphitheatre in the eastern section of the city was the largest structure in Pompeii, seating approximately 20,000 people, nearly twice the normal population of the city, which meant it drew significant numbers of visitors from the surrounding towns for its events. It had been the site, in 59 CE, 20 years before the eruption, of a famous riot between the Pompeians and visitors from the neighbouring city of Nuceria, a riot that resulted in deaths and injuries, and that prompted the Roman Senate to ban gladiatorial games at Pompeii for a period of 10 years. The ban had long since been lifted, and the games had resumed. The next scheduled games were not that morning. Gladiatorial events were not daily occurrences but periodic festivals, so the amphitheatre was empty of its crowd, its stone seating baking in the August sun, the sand of the arena floor pale and smooth. The gladiators in their barracks were doing what gladiators did on an ordinary morning: training. The gladiatorial life was intensely physical, built around the sustained maintenance of the body as a fighting instrument, and the training regime was continuous and demanding. The different types of gladiators, the Murmillo with his heavy Gallic-style helmet and curved shield, the Thrax with his curved Psyker sword and small shield, the Retiarius with his net and trident and no helmet, trained with their specific equipment and against each other in the practice of the specific techniques that their fight styles required. The gladiators were not all equal in status. The successful ones who had survived many fights accumulated prize money and fame and occasionally received their freedom, while the novices and the less skilled occupied a lower position in the internal hierarchy of the barracks. The women who visited the barracks, the wealthy woman whose jewellery was found there, were part of the specific social phenomenon of gladiatorial celebrity, the way that the performers of dangerous physical skill attracted both adulation and intimate attention from the population they thrilled. There was a fullery on the Via dell'Abbondanza, a fullonica, one of the establishments where wool cloth was cleaned and processed. The process was straightforward and deeply unpleasant. The cloth was immersed in vats of a solution containing human urine, then agitated by workers who stood in the vats and trampled the cloth with their feet. The urine's ammonia content acted as a cleaning agent, breaking down the lanolin and dirt in the wool. The fulleries collected urine from the public by placing large ceramic vessels in the street outside their establishments, where passers-by could relieve themselves and contribute to the process. The fulleries were numerous in Pompeii. There were at least a dozen identified, and they were a significant part of the city's industrial activity, processing the wool cloth that the textile trade required. They were also, by all accounts, very smelly, which may be why the fullery near the Via dell'Abbondanza is not in one of the prime commercial locations. The mill bakeries of Pompeii were the most mechanically complex establishments in the city. The bakery of Modestus, where the 81 loaves waited in the oven, was one of approximately 33 bakeries identified in the city, an extraordinary number that speaks to the importance of bread in the Roman diet and to the commercial scale of bread production in Pompeii. The bakeries were large enough to have multiple grinding mills, driven by donkeys or horses walking in circles to turn the volcanic basalt millstones, and large enough to produce bread for sale beyond the immediate neighbourhood. The donkeys or horses that drove the mills would have been at their work in the early morning hours, the millstones turning continuously, the flour accumulating, the baker and his workers shaping the loaves and placing them in the large domed ovens that were the defining feature of a Roman bakery. There was a pottery in the city making the small lamps that were the Roman world's primary lighting technology. The lamps were terracotta, made in two-piece molds, with a filling hole for the olive oil and a wick hole for the burning wick. They came in standard sizes and were produced in vast numbers. The Roman world burned through enormous quantities of lamps, since artificial lighting depended entirely on oil lamps and candles. The Pompeian potters who made lamps were producing a commodity that was as necessary as bread, and their workshops were as busy as the bakeries. The molds for the specific decorative designs on Pompeian lamps, the erotic scenes, the mythological figures, the simple floral patterns, have been found at the sites of the workshops, along with the failures and the seconds that the quality control process rejected. The Thermopolium of Asselina, near the intersection of the Via dell'Abbondanza with a side street, was decorated with painted election notices endorsing local candidates, and the names of several women associated with the bar, Asselina, Smirina, Maria, Egel, suggest that the establishment's female staff were prominent enough to be named in the political endorsements. The bar had a standard counter with the embedded dolia, and the food stall behind the counter would have been serving from early morning. What was in the dolia at the Thermopolium of Asselina on the morning of the 24th is not recorded by any source, but we can make an educated guess based on the analysis of the contents of similar thermopolia. Cooked pulses, perhaps a bean stew or a lentil preparation, bread, fish sauce as a condiment, perhaps some cooked meat in one of the larger vessels, wine diluted with water, served from amphorae stored in the back room. The women who managed the bar of Asselina, or who worked in it, since the relationship between the named women and the establishment's ownership is not entirely clear from the surviving evidence, were part of the substantial presence of women in Pompeii's commercial life that the archaeology reveals, and that the legal and social framework of the Roman world simultaneously enabled and constrained. Women could own property and conduct business in Roman law, but they were excluded from most of the formal political and civic roles that the city's public life organized around. The women whose names appear in the electoral notices of Pompeii are not endorsing candidates for offices they could hold. They are participating in civic life through the specifically female channels available to them: the endorsement, the patronage, the commercial relationship, and then, in the early afternoon, the mountain, the pine tree cloud that Pliny the Younger saw from Misenum, the darkness that fell over the bay as the eruption column blocked the sun. The sound, what did it sound like? There are accounts from survivors of other Plinian eruptions that describe the sound as a continuous roar, like a waterfall, or like thunder that does not stop. And the specific acoustic quality of a large volcanic eruption, the shaking of the ground, the low-frequency vibration that is felt as much as heard, would have been unlike anything the Pompeians had experienced before. Some of them fled, some of them sheltered, some of them died in the streets. Pliny the Elder set out from Misenum in his naval ships, intending first to observe the phenomenon more closely, and then, when he received a message from a woman named Rectina, who was trapped at her villa at the base of the mountain with no means of escape by land, changing his purpose to rescue. He sailed toward the mountain, through the falling pumice and the darkness, reached the shore at Stebiae, a town south of Pompeii, and spent the night at the house of his friend Pomponianus, who was unable to sail because the wind was against him. Pliny the Elder's behaviour that night, as his nephew later described it, was conspicuously calm. He bathed, ate dinner, slept. The next morning, when the situation at Stebiae became critical as the pyroclastic flows approached, he went down to the beach. He died there, probably of heart failure or asphyxiation from the toxic gases, found the next day lying on the beach still fully clothed, looking more like a sleeping man than a dead one. His nephew survived. He was 17 years old when the eruption happened, staying at Misenum with his mother while his uncle commanded the fleet. He watched the eruption from across the bay, saw the cloud, wrote his 2 letters to Tacitus, and in doing so gave us the document, without which our understanding of the eruption would be vastly poorer. Pliny the Younger lived to a prosperous and distinguished career as a lawyer and a writer, survived into the early 2nd century, and left behind a large correspondence that is one of the most valuable literary sources for the social and political history of the early Roman Empire. He never forgot the day his uncle died. He wrote about it clearly and precisely, and with an emotional restraint that makes the events more affecting, not less. Back in Pompeii, through the afternoon and into the night and through the hours before dawn, the people who had not yet escaped were making their calculations in the dark. under the accumulating pumice, in the failing light of their oil lamps. The lamps would have been burning everywhere, because the volcanic cloud had blocked the sun, and the city was in a darkness that lasted for days. The lamps would have been running low on oil. The pumice on the roofs was accumulating, and the sounds of roof failure would have been audible through the city. The temperature was dropping, because the eruption column was so high that it had altered the local weather pattern, and somewhere in the cold dark of an August night that should have been warm, in a city that should have been winding down towards sleep, but was instead full of the sounds of disaster, the bread in Modestus's oven was completing its transformation from food to carbon. The pyroclastic flows that finished the city came in waves, beginning in the early hours of the morning. The first surges came down the mountain's northwestern face toward Herculaneum, the smaller city closer to the mountain's base, which had been relatively spared by the pumice fall because the wind had blown the initial eruption column southward toward Pompeii. Herculaneum was destroyed in minutes by the pyroclastic flows that followed. The flows reached Pompeii shortly after, from the northwest, sweeping through the streets in waves of superheated gas and fine volcanic material that killed instantly and preserved in the hardened ash the exact positions of the people they killed. In the Via dell'Abbondanza, the stepping stones that allowed pedestrians to cross without getting their feet wet were submerged under meters of volcanic material. The bar of Salvius, with its painted sign showing the dice players, was buried. The Thermopolium of Asalina, with its counter and its dolia and the names of its women painted on the outside wall, was buried. The bread in the oven of Modestus, the 81 loaves, scored and round and patient, was buried. The whole city was buried under the specific volcanic material that hardened over time into something like rock and that preserved, in its stone embrace, the organic record of a single August morning. The city stayed buried for nearly 1700 years. It was rediscovered in the late 16th century, when building work in the area uncovered some inscriptions and a few buildings. Systematic excavation began in the 18th century under the Bourbon kings of Naples and has continued in various forms ever since. The excavations of the 19th century produced the famous plaster casts when a technique was developed for pouring liquid plaster into the cavities left in the hardened ash by the decomposed organic matter. The excavations of the 20th and 21st centuries have applied increasingly sophisticated scientific methods to the question of what happened and who the people were. Isotope analysis of bones to determine where individuals grew up, genetic analysis of preserved biological material, environmental analysis of the sediment layers to reconstruct the local ecology, chemical analysis of the food residues in the dolia and the cooking vessels. Pompeii is the most studied single archaeological site in the world. It has been producing new knowledge continuously for 2.5 centuries, and it continues to produce new knowledge. The Great Pompeii Project, begun in 2012, has uncovered new rooms, new paintings, new inscriptions, new bodies, including in 2020, the remains of 2 men found in a room of a villa at the edge of the city, one identified as a high-status man of about 30, and the other as a young slave of about 20, both killed by the pyroclastic flow, their positions and the objects near them suggesting the specific circumstances of their final moments, in more detail than I will describe here. The knowledge accumulates. Every dig season produces something that was not known before, a new fresco, a new inscription, a new skeleton in a new position that tells us something about the human experience of those final hours that the previous knowledge did not include. And each new discovery is both a gain and a reminder. A reminder that what we have found is not the city, but the ruins of the city. And the city was populated by people whose fullness of experience is irretrievably beyond our reach. The bread. I keep coming back to the bread, because the bread is the beginning and the end. The bread is the city's first sentence to us, and its last. This was morning, and we were making food, and then we were not. The bread is what the baker knew how to make, and what the baker made, and what the baker never finished making. The bread is the most ordinary thing in the world, and the most specific thing in the world, because it is this bread, from this oven, on this morning, made by this person whose name we may or may not know. And it has been waiting 2,000 years for someone to understand that it matters. It matters because it is real. It matters because the morning was real, and the bread was real, and the baker was real, and the mountain was real, and the gap between the ordinary morning and the volcanic afternoon was crossed in an instant that no one in the city had time to comprehend before it happened to them. It matters because we are made of the same kind of mourning. Our mournings are also ordinary, also full of the specific texture of tasks that have to be done, and transactions that have to be completed, and conversations that have to be had, and bread that has to go in the oven before the customers come. Our mournings are also crossed, sometimes without warning, by the extraordinary, the bread in the oven, the baker who made it, the morning that ended before it could become afternoon. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE is one of the most documented events in ancient history. And yet what it documented was not history in the usual sense. It documented a single morning, a morning that was, by every indication, unremarkable until it became the most remarkable thing that had happened to those people in their lifetimes. The documentation happened accidentally, through the specific physical properties of the volcanic material that buried the city, which hardened around organic matter and preserved its shape, while the organic matter itself decomposed. The city became its own archive, storing the evidence of its last morning in the material that destroyed it. The mountain that ended Pompeii also saved it. This paradox is the specific gift of the disaster, and it is a gift that has been accumulating in value for nearly 2,000 years as each generation of scholars and archaeologists and visitors finds in the preserved morning something that they could not have found anywhere else. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. There is one more thing I want to give you before we leave the city. It is the garden of the House of the Vetii, that elaborate, carefully designed peristyle garden that the wealthy freedman brothers were still having replanted when the eruption came. Was planted with specific species in specific positions, and we know this because the roots of the plants left cavities in the volcanic soil, just as the bodies left cavities in the volcanic ash. And those root cavities have been excavated and cast in plaster in the same way as the bodies. The garden of the House of the Vetii has been replanted in the modern excavations management of the site, with the same species in the same positions that the botanical evidence indicates. The roses, the oleanders, the specific placement of the marble fountains and the bronze statuettes that the brothers had installed as part of their display of prosperity. The garden, in its modern replanting, is as close to the garden as it was on the morning of the eruption as 2,000 years of separation and careful scholarship can make it. Standing in the garden of the House of the Vetii, with the roses and the oleanders and the marble fountains and the bronze figures and the painted walls visible through the colonnade that surrounds the garden on all four sides, you are in a space that was designed and built and maintained by specific people whose names we know, who died in this city 2,000 years ago, and who wanted their garden to look like this. The garden does not know that they are gone. The roses bloom in August as they bloomed in August in 79 CE. The marble surface of the fountain catches the light in the afternoon, in the way it caught the light on the morning before the mountain ended the afternoon. The garden simply is, in its quiet, specific beauty, in the morning that preceded the catastrophe, and in the morning of today, equally present, equally ordinary, equally real. The question that Pompeii asks, and that I find I cannot stop asking after spending time with it, is not a question about death. It is a question about the ordinary. Why does the ordinary so rarely survive? We are surrounded by ordinary things, bread and dogs and gardens and graffiti and bars and political arguments, and the small rituals of household worship, and the careful management of property, and the specific social negotiations of commercial life. These things make up the actual texture of the days that we live, and yet they leave almost no trace. The history that survives is the history of the unusual, the extraordinary, the deliberately preserved, the monuments and the chronicles and the official documents and the great works of art. The morning bread does not survive. The dog does not survive. The argument about the dice game does not survive. They were real. They were the substance of millions of actual days, and they are gone. Pompeii is the exception. Pompeii is the one place where the morning bread survived, where the argument on the wall survived, where the garden survived, where the ordinary was involuntarily made extraordinary by the catastrophe that ended it. And in its exceptionality, Pompeii points back to all the ordinary mornings that did not survive, all the bread that was baked and eaten without incident, all the dogs that lived their ordinary dog lives and died ordinary deaths, all the graffiti that was painted over or worn away, all the gardens that were planted and grew and died in the normal rhythm of seasons, rather than the sudden finality of volcanic ash. Pompeii is the ordinary made visible by the extraordinary. It is the morning that everyone has every day, preserved by the afternoon that no one expected. This is what the bread in the oven means. Not just the specific bread of Modestus's bakery, but the idea of bread in an oven. The most ordinary food in the world, being made in the most ordinary way, on a morning that was ordinary until it wasn't. The bread in the oven is the morning, and the morning is all of us. This is what Pompeii gives us that no other place gives us in quite the same way. The specific reality of ordinary life, preserved in ordinary detail, waiting in its glass cases and its excavated streets and its replanted gardens for anyone who takes the time to look. Not the drama of the ending, though the ending was dramatic, but the texture of what was ended. The bread and the dog and the garden and the graffiti and the bars and the mills and the political notices and the goddess in the lararium and the mosaic dog at the entrance and the specific, human, inimitable, irreplaceable morning that all of these things were part of, the morning that ended at lunch. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.